From the moment Alexander ascended the throne of Macedon, the world sensed a shift. His father's assassination could have shattered the kingdom. Yet the young prince, only 20 years old, stood firm. Instead of collapsing, Greece rallied behind him. City-states that once challenged Macedonian authority suddenly recognized a leader who moved with purpose, spoke with conviction, and carried the legacy of a warrior king. Alexander inherited more than a crown. He inherited a mission, a promise his father had begun but never fulfilled: to confront the vast Persian Empire and restore honor to the Greek world. Imagine the pressure of stepping into power at such a young age. Enemies watched closely, waiting for a misstep. Allies questioned whether he had his father's strength. Yet Alexander silenced every doubt with speed and strategy. He secured the borders, unified the Greek states, and transformed uncertainty into momentum. This was not just leadership. It was the rise of a force that would reshape history. As we dive into this extraordinary journey from a newly crowned king to the commander who changed the ancient world, make sure you do not miss any part of the story. If you enjoy deep dive documentaries, powerful historical narratives, and cinematic storytelling, remember to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. Your support helps us bring more epic stories like this to life. Now, let us step into the world of Alexander, the young ruler who refused to accept limits and dared to dream beyond the borders of the known world. He crossed into Asia at the head of 37,000 determined soldiers. But the moment his boots touched the unfamiliar soil, it felt less like the beginning of a military campaign and more like the next chapter of a destiny he had been preparing for his entire life, one shaped by lessons from childhood, the weight of a kingdom newly secured, and the spirit of a father whose ambitions still echoed in every step he took. The winds along the coast carried with them the scent of distant lands and old stories. And as the army advanced toward Troy, Alexander himself seemed to move with a quiet certainty, as if he understood that history was waiting for him just beyond the horizon. When he arrived at the ancient city, he did not rush toward battle, nor did he concern himself with the complexities of the Persian frontier. Instead, he approached the legendary tomb of Achilles, the hero he had admired since boyhood, and laid a wreath in solemn respect. The gesture was more than symbolic. It was a declaration of the kind of leader he aspired to be: swift in action, fearless in pursuit, and unwavering in loyalty to those who came before him. His men watched in silence, sensing that their commander was aligning himself with the mythic past in preparation for the trials to come, grounding mortal ambition in immortal tradition. From Troy, the army pushed eastward, moving across rugged terrain and river valleys until the Persian presence became impossible to ignore. The Persian Empire was vast, wealthy, and confident, stretching from Anatolia to India. Yet its local governors underestimated the young king from Macedonia, assuming he would test their borders, posture for advantage, or negotiate for influence. But Alexander had no interest in half measures. As the opposing forces gathered near the river Granicus, he saw an opportunity not only to confront Persia's first line of defense, but to send a message so clear it would echo across the empire. Macedonia had arrived, and it would not be turned back. The Persian commanders arranged their cavalry along the riverbank, certain the rushing waters would deter any direct assault. But Alexander studied the landscape, gauged the current, and made his choice with the same steady resolve that had allowed him to unify his homeland. At the moment of engagement, he charged across the river with his elite companion cavalry, the spray of water rising around them as they crashed into the Persian line with unexpected force. The fighting was fierce, chaotic, and immediate. Yet Alexander moved through it with a precision that left even seasoned veterans astonished. His helmet and plumes rose clearly above the melee, making him both a target and an inspiration, a living reminder that a leader's place was not behind his soldiers but beside them. As the Macedonian phalanx advanced, their long sarissas locking into an impenetrable wall, the Persians began to falter, Startled by the speed and discipline of an opponent they had assumed would hesitate. Bit, their line broke, their cavalry withdrew, and the field shifted unmistakably in Alexander's favor. When the dust finally settled, the victory at Granicus was complete. Sudden and transformative, it was not merely a triumph on a battlefield. It was a watershed moment that reshaped the balance of power in the region. The satrapies of Asia Minor now lay vulnerable. Greek cities under Persian control saw the first glimmer of liberation. And Alexander's men understood that their commander did not lead them toward uncertain glory, but toward a path he fully believed was his to walk. The campaign had only begun, yet already the world was taking notice. Sensing that the young king who had stepped onto Asian soil was not simply continuing his father's mission, he was forging a legend that would endure long after the dust of Granicus had settled. The victory at Granicus had shifted the course of Alexander's campaign. But it was only when he pushed deeper into the Persian territories that the full scale of the challenge ahead revealed itself. Word of the young Macedonian king's triumph raced across the empire, eventually reaching the ears of King Darius, who realized that this was no border skirmish, no minor disturbance to be settled by regional forces. The approach of Alexander's army was steady and relentless, capturing key cities, securing supply lines, and earning the allegiance of populations long resentful of Persian rule. But Alexander knew that as long as Darius remained unbroken, the conflict would never truly be resolved. Their inevitable confrontation arrived near the coastal plains of Issus, where the rugged mountains narrowed the battlefield into a tight corridor. This terrain, forged by nature over ages, unexpectedly favored the smaller Macedonian force, compressing Darius' vast numbers into a confined space where their advantage could not fully unfold. Alexander sensed opportunity in this constraint and arranged his troops with careful precision, placing himself once again at the head of the companion cavalry. When the engagement began, the roar of tens of thousands reverberated across the field, but Alexander advanced with controlled momentum, steering his cavalry in a sweeping maneuver that cut through the Persian left while the phalanx held firm at the center. The chaos of battle churned around him, yet he rode with a clarity that made even the most hardened soldiers feel a renewed surge of determination. Darius, positioned on a towering royal chariot, watched in disbelief as the Macedonian line carved deeper into his defenses. A sudden breach appeared, and Alexander aimed directly for it, creating a ripple of panic that spread through the Persian ranks. The sight of their king withdrawing from the field sealed the outcome. Once Darius turned away, the army fragmented, leaving Alexander with a stunning victory that reverberated throughout the region. Yet Alexander did not linger in triumph, for he knew this encounter was only the beginning. As long as the Persian king remained free, the empire's heart continued to beat, capable of rallying new forces, forging new alliances, and resisting the Macedonian advance. Months later, after securing the eastern Mediterranean and reducing Persian strongholds one by one, Alexander marched toward the open plains of Gaugamela. Unlike Issus, where the landscape had compressed Darius' army, here the Persian king had chosen ground ideally suited for his vast forces. The plain had been cleared and leveled to allow his war chariots maximum mobility, and soldiers from across the empire had been assembled to form a massive host that dwarfed Alexander's comparatively modest army. Despite the scale of what lay before him, Alexander approached the battlefield with the same composed intensity that had guided him since Asia's shores. He spent the night before the battle calmly strategizing, studying every advantage the terrain offered, and preparing a plan that defied conventional expectations. When dawn broke, he positioned his forces in a stretched formation that invited the Persian flanks to extend and overreach. As the Persian cavalry surged forward, Alexander executed a calculated oblique advance, drawing the enemy outward and subtly creating a gap in their center. The moment the breach appeared, he acted with extraordinary speed, leading a direct charge toward the very heart of Darius' line. Dust rose like a veil around the battlefield, obscuring vision and heightening the tension. But Alexander pressed through the storm of noise and motion with unwavering purpose. His thrust toward Darius sowed confusion across the Persian command. And once again the king, feeling the pressure closing in around him, withdrew from the field. With the loss of cohesion that followed, the vast Persian army began to collapse. Not through lack of courage, but through the sudden absence of leadership. When the battle ended, the victory at Gaugamela reshaped the course of history. It marked not just a military triumph, but the effective end of Persian control over its ancient dominions. For Alexander's soldiers, it affirmed that their commander's daring was not reckless but visionary. For the world beyond, it signaled that the young king forging his path across continents was no longer merely challenging an empire, he was redefining the very limits of power and ambition. In the aftermath of Gaugamela, as the dust settled across the vast plain and the remnants of the Persian army vanished into the horizon, a new reality began to take shape, one in which Alexander stood not merely as a victorious commander, but as the inheritor of an empire centuries in the making. The defeat of Darius had left a power vacuum stretching from the Mediterranean to the mountains of Persia, and Alexander understood that victory on the battlefield was only the beginning. What lay ahead were cities legendary for their wealth and cultural splendor. Places that had shaped the identity of the empire he had now effectively seized. As he and his army advanced toward Babylon, the soldiers braced themselves for resistance. But what awaited them was something entirely unexpected. The gates of the city opened without a struggle, and the people greeted Alexander not as an invader but as a liberator. The ancient metropolis, with its towering walls and storied past, seemed to welcome the young king into its heart, allowing him to step across its threshold as though fulfilling a destiny whispered across generations. Within Babylon's immense palaces, he moved through halls adorned with carved lions and glazed bricks that captured the glow of the setting sun. He treated the city with measured respect, restoring local leaders, honoring its temples, and ensuring that its traditions remained intact. This approach, both strategic and symbolic, reflected his growing understanding that ruling an empire required more than military might. It demanded wisdom, adaptability, and a willingness to bridge cultures. From Babylon, his march carried him eastward to Susa, another center of Persian power, where riches gathered over centuries seemed to defy imagination. Here, too, the transition of authority unfolded with remarkable ease, as though the momentum of history itself was guiding Alexander's steps. He assumed control of the treasury, ensuring the resources necessary to maintain his expanding domain. But he also emphasized continuity, acknowledging that the stability of these lands depended on respecting their established customs. The journey to Persepolis, the ceremonial heart of the Persian Empire, held a different weight. This was not merely a city but a symbol, a place where kings had celebrated their lineage and authority through monumental architecture and intricate artistry. As Alexander approached, the sense of significance deepened, for he knew that entering Persepolis marked a turning point. The city did not fall through negotiation or ritual submission. Its resistance had been real, its defenses formidable. When it finally opened to Alexander, the victory carried a solemn resonance, reflecting both the grandeur of the empire he had overtaken and the immense responsibility now resting upon his shoulders. Walking through its palaces, he observed sculpted processions of tribute-bearers, immense halls supported by carved pillars, and stairways designed for rulers who believed their legacy would endure unchallenged. The very stones seemed to echo with the ambitions of kings long gone. And Alexander, absorbing this atmosphere, recognized that he was stepping into a role far greater than any he had previously held. Though Persepolis surrendered its treasures, it also confronted Alexander with the weight of the empire's cultural identity, forcing him to reconcile conquest with the stewardship of nations. He issued orders that balanced firmness with restraint, ensuring order while striving to avoid needless disruption. Yet even in this moment of triumph, He understood that ruling the largest empire in the world was not simply a matter of absorbing territories. It required unifying diverse peoples, bridging languages, religions, and traditions, and guiding a realm whose boundaries seemed to stretch toward the edge of imagination. As he established his authority over Babylon, Susa, Persepolis, and the countless lands tied to them, Alexander's transformation became unmistakable. He was no longer the young king who had crossed into Asia seeking to fulfill his father's legacy. He had become a figure who shaped the course of nations, carrying on his shoulders an empire whose size, complexity, and influence surpassed anything the world had previously known. As the vast territories of Persia came under his authority, Alexander found himself at the center of a realm unlike anything Macedonia had ever known, a place shaped by ancient customs, intricate court rituals, and a political structure that demanded more than military brilliance. He had conquered the lands, but ruling them required stepping into a role much larger than that of a victorious general. Surrounded by the grandeur of palaces in Babylon and Persepolis, and aware that he was now responsible for the lives of millions, he began to adopt elements of Persian governance, believing that blending traditions would help stabilize the empire. These choices, though strategic, marked the beginning of a new phase in his journey, one defined not by battles, but by the delicate balance between maintaining authority and navigating the loyalties of those closest to him. As he wore Persian robes during official ceremonies and embraced the etiquette of the royal court, he appeared to many as a king seeking unity, but to others, especially the Macedonians who had grown up with him, these changes seemed unsettling, as though their leader was slowly drifting into a world where they no longer fully recognized him. The introduction of Persian customs was not merely a matter of clothing or ceremony. Extended to the ritual of proskynesis, an act of respectful obeisance practiced in the Persian court. For Persians, it symbolized honor and hierarchy, but to Macedonians, men who had fought by Alexander's side, shared hardships, and spoken to him as comrades, it felt like a barrier rising between them. Alexander, convinced that the stability of his empire depended on unifying diverse traditions, believed these gestures were necessary. Yet each attempt to introduce them stirred discomfort, murmurs of dissent, and the growing sense that the king who had once charged into battle beside them was now placing himself on a plane too elevated for familiar bonds to survive. The tension did not erupt at once. It simmered beneath the surface, woven into conversations whispered among officers during long marches, then resurfaced during celebrations where wine loosened tongues and old grievances broke free. Among those who struggled most with Alexander's transformation were the companions who had known him longest, men who remembered him not as a symbol of empire but as the energetic, ambitious prince of Macedonia. Their unease reached a breaking point during heated exchanges in royal halls, where questions of identity, loyalty, and power collided. The atmosphere grew increasingly volatile, and the strain between Alexander's vision and his companions' expectations began to overshadow even the victories they had shared. One such moment, fueled by frustration and the widening gulf between king and companions, escalated beyond repair. Words thrown in anger spiraled into conflict, revealing not only resentment toward Persian customs but deeper fears that Alexander's ambitions were carrying him into realms where no one could follow. In the aftermath, judgment fell swiftly, and the consequences were severe. Executions, once unthinkable among those who had marched beside him since the early days of the campaign, marked a shift that sent shockwaves through the ranks. Alexander was deeply affected by these events, torn between the demands of ruling a vast empire and the emotional toll of losing those who had stood with him through danger and triumph alike. Yet he pressed forward, convinced that leadership required decisions beyond personal bonds, even when the cost weighed heavily on his heart. As he continued to merge Macedonian and Persian traditions, the empire expanded, but the circle of companions around him grew thinner, shaped by the tension between loyalty and authority. Through these moments, it became clear that Alexander's journey was evolving into something far more complex than conquest. He was not only forging an empire across continents. He was wrestling with the challenge of becoming a ruler capable of bridging worlds that had never before been united, even as the personal sacrifices demanded by this vision carved new scars across his spirit. As the stability of Persia gradually settled under his authority, Alexander turned his gaze toward the distant frontiers that stretched far beyond the familiar landscapes of Babylon and Persepolis, toward regions where empires had never fully secured control and where resistance waited in valleys, mountains, and deserts shaped by centuries of independence. Central Asia was not a land conquered by grand battles or swift maneuvers. It was a place where harsh terrain, scattered fortresses, and fiercely autonomous tribes demanded patience, endurance, and a resilience unlike anything the army had faced before. Yet Alexander pressed onward with the same decisive momentum that had carried him across Asia Minor and into the heart of Persia. His soldiers followed him through mountain passes where winds cut like blades, across desolate plains where water was scarce and the horizon seemed endlessly out of reach, and through settlements defended not by organized armies but by people determined to protect the homes their ancestors had built from stone and earth. Each new obstacle revealed the limits of traditional tactics, and Alexander adapted, reshaping his strategies to meet the unpredictable challenges of a world where geography itself felt like an adversary. The campaign was not merely a continuation of conquest, but a test of endurance that pushed Alexander's leadership into new territory. The intensity of the environment forged a different rhythm, one marked not by rapid victories, but by grueling marches, sudden ambushes, and long stretches of uncertainty where the line between progress and stagnation grew blurred. Even so, Alexander's determination never faltered, and he sought to strengthen his connection to these lands not only through military force, but also through alliances that could anchor his rule more deeply. It was during these years of relentless campaigning that he met Roxana, a woman whose presence would leave a lasting imprint on his life and legacy. Their marriage was both a personal union and a symbolic gesture, signaling his intention to bridge cultural divides and integrate the noble families of Central Asia into the fabric of his expanding empire. To his soldiers, weary from the unending challenges of the campaign, the wedding brought a moment of respite, a reminder that even amid hardship there were moments of humanity that could soften the edges of war. Yet the resistance in these remote regions proved unyielding. Tribes that had weathered countless invasions refused to be subdued easily, retreating into mountain strongholds or vanishing into landscapes they knew far better than any foreign army. Alexander's pursuit of them drove his forces through ravines where shadows concealed danger, across rivers swollen with melting snow, and over ridges where narrow paths threatened to crumble beneath their feet. Each victory felt hard-earned, and each setback reminded the army that they were far from the ordered battlefields where phalanxes could move in perfect unison. The terrain forced them into smaller units, scattered engagements, and constant vigilance. Still, Alexander remained tireless, driven not only by ambition, but by a belief that control over these regions was essential to securing the stability of the empire he had built. His presence at the front, sharing the hardships, enduring the same storms, and confronting the same dangers kept his men moving forward even when exhaustion pressed heavily upon them. The further they advanced, the more the landscape seemed to stretch endlessly, a vast, untamed expanse that tested both spirit and discipline. But Alexander saw these challenges not as deterrents, but as steps toward a vision in which the edges of his empire reached heights no ruler had ever imagined. His march through Central Asia became a testament to his adaptability, his resilience, and his willingness to reshape both strategy and identity in pursuit of a unified realm. Every fortress taken, every alliance forged, And every hardship endured added another layer to the complex tapestry of his journey, a journey that was no longer defined solely by conquest, but by the pursuit of something deeper. Something that blended the worlds he had brought together and carried him ever farther from the familiar lands where his story had begun. The long march across Central Asia had hardened Alexander's army into a force accustomed to uncertainty. Yet nothing fully prepared them for the moment when the landscape began to shift once more, changing from barren stretches of rock and sand to the lush, river-rich lands that marked the approach to the Indian subcontinent. Stories had reached them of powerful kingdoms beyond the horizon, of rulers who commanded vast territories and armies unlike any they had faced before. And Alexander, driven by the same curiosity and ambition that had carried him from Greece to the far edges of Persia, pushed onward. The rains came heavier here, the air thicker, and the rivers wider than anything the Macedonians had known. But the challenge only sharpened Alexander's determination. He moved with the confidence of a leader who believed that the world still held more mysteries for him to uncover, more achievements to inscribe into the legacy that was rapidly expanding with every mile traveled. As they advanced deeper into this unfamiliar land, they encountered new cultures, new languages, and new forms of warfare, each encounter adding another layer to the journey that had begun years earlier on the shores of Asia Minor. The true test revealed itself at the banks of the Hyphasis River, where King Poros gathered his forces to confront the foreign army that had marched across continents. Poros was not a regional satrap nor a minor frontier ruler. He was a monarch whose stature, discipline, and authority commanded loyalty from his warriors, including units mounted on towering war elephants that cast long shadows over the riverbank. Alexander understood immediately that this would be unlike any battle he had fought before. The river, swollen with monsoon rain, acted as a natural barrier, and crossing it under the watch of Poros's army seemed nearly impossible. But Alexander, ever the strategist, devised a plan that relied on deception, speed, and his ability to strike where his enemy least expected. Over several nights, he orchestrated feints along the river, keeping Poros constantly on guard, never certain when or where the crossing would occur. Then, in a moment of sudden clarity amid a storm-shrouded night, Alexander led a selected force upstream, crossed the turbulent waters, and positioned himself on the opposite bank before Poros fully realized what had unfolded. The clash that followed was fierce and unrelenting. The Macedonian cavalry surged forward, met by the thunderous advance of elephants whose sheer presence shook the ground beneath them. Alexander maneuvered with precision, adjusting his tactics in the midst of battle to counter the unfamiliar formations before him. The phalanx held firm under pressure, weaving between the massive beasts, while Alexander exploited every opening with the instinct of a commander who understood that victory here depended not only on strength but on adaptability. Poros fought with remarkable resilience, maintaining order even as the battle tilted slowly toward the Macedonian side. When the final moments approached, and Poros, wounded and exhausted, stood before Alexander, the young king recognized in him the qualities of a ruler worthy of respect. Instead of demanding submission, he restored Poros's kingdom and granted him even greater territories, forging an alliance that reflected both admiration and strategic insight. Yet the triumph at Hyphasis did not bring the sense of forward momentum that had followed previous victories. The army, worn by years of ceaseless marching, faced the towering reports of lands even farther east, kingdoms vast, distant, and rumored to possess armies greater than any they had encountered. Beneath the surface of celebration, fatigue settled heavily into the hearts of soldiers who had crossed deserts, mountains, and rivers in service of a dream that now seemed boundless. When Alexander gathered his men and spoke of continuing deeper into India, the response was not the familiar roar of enthusiasm, but a silence that carried the weight of exhaustion. Leaders among the ranks stepped forward, not in defiance but in wary honesty, expressing that their strength had reached its limit They were loyal, but they were tired. Victorious, but they longed for the lands they had left behind. In that moment, Alexander confronted a reality even he could not defy. He withdrew from the edge of further conquest, not defeated by any enemy, but halted by the will of the men who had carried him through every triumph. As the decision settled, the river flowed quietly beside them, marking the turning point where ambition met the limits of human endurance, and the journey that had once seemed unstoppable began its long path homeward. The decision to turn back from the edge of India marked not the end of Alexander's ambition, but the beginning of a return journey far harsher than any of his men had imagined. Instead of retracing their earlier path, he led a portion of his forces through the Gedrosian desert, a vast expanse of scorching winds, shifting sands, and unforgiving emptiness. What awaited them there was not the challenge of an enemy, but the merciless weight of nature itself. Days blended into one another as water ran low. Supplies dwindled, and the sun punished every step. Men who had survived years of battle now fell to thirst, exhaustion, and the brutal monotony of a landscape that offered no mercy. Alexander marched alongside them, refusing special treatment, sharing their rations, and helping the wounded whenever he could. But even his presence could not prevent the terrible losses that accumulated across the desert's endless horizon. When the army finally emerged from Gedrosia, changed by suffering and thinned by hardship, Alexander carried the burden not only of the campaign but of the lives lost under his command. He pressed on to Babylon, determined to rebuild stability, restore order, and shape the empire's future. Yet another blow soon descended. Hephaestion, his closest companion since youth, fell ill and died. The news struck Alexander deeper than any sword or spear ever had. The man who had stood beside him through every triumph, every trial, and every moment of uncertainty was gone, and the grief that followed carved itself into Alexander's spirit. He ordered honors befitting a prince, planned monuments, and withdrew increasingly into the solitude of mourning. Even as the responsibilities of an enormous empire pressed around him, despite the sorrow, Alexander resumed his work with urgency, expanding plans for new cities, reorganizing territories, and envisioning expeditions that would link the corners of his empire in ways no ruler had attempted before. Babylon, vibrant and bustling, stood ready to become the center of this grand design. But as preparations unfolded, Alexander fell suddenly ill during a banquet and never recovered. Fever consumed him over several days, weakening the man who had crossed continents, defeated kings, and reshaped the world. Surrounded by generals who had followed him from the earliest campaigns, he struggled to speak, and when asked to whom he left his vast empire, he offered words that have sparked debate for centuries, words that seemed to acknowledge both the enormity of his achievement and the impossibility of holding it together through any single successor. In 323 BC, at just 32 years old, Alexander died in Babylon, leaving behind an empire larger than any the world had known and a legacy that would echo through history long after the borders he created dissolved into the ambitions of rival generals. His realm fractured almost immediately, divided among those who had once served him, but the imprint of his journey, his battles, his vision, and the sheer scale of his achievements continued to shape cultures, ideas, and civilizations across continents. Thank you for listening to this story. If you enjoyed this journey through history, please remember to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more captivating explorations of the past.